Hello and welcome to another fairy tale deep dive. Not so much a deep dive today because I could hardly find any history at all about it. So today's fairy tale is one called The Brewery of Eggshells. You had me at brewery. And this one was collected by Thomas Crofton Croker in the year 1825 in his first collection of Fairy Legends and Traditions of the South of Ireland. Yes, we are not in the grim world of Germany today. Today we are going to the Emerald Isle. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So we're starting off with, there's a woman by the name of Mrs. Sullivan, and she is convinced that her youngest child has been exchanged in a fairy theft, which is basically a changeling. And certainly the baby was changed through and through. It certainly wasn't the same child that she had had. Her baby was blue-eyed, bonny, chubby, healthy, full of just life and vigour. Whereas this new one overnight had shriveled into almost nothing and would not stop crying. Constantly crying. Now, she was really unhappy, which you would be anyway with a baby constantly crying, but her neighbours tried to make her feel better. And how did they try to make her feel better? They said, there, it's alright. Your baby's probably just been taken by the good fairies and not the bad ones. So, there, carry on. Which, as you can imagine, helped a hell of a lot. Now, Mrs. Sullivan couldn't disprove what the neighbours said about her child being taken by the good fairies, but nor could she prove it, and she couldn't bring herself to hurt the pitiful little thing that was in the cradle at the moment, no matter that it wasn't her child. For although its face was withered and haggard, and its body was practically a skeleton, it bore enough of a resemblance to the baby that was no longer there, that she stayed her hand. And she couldn't find it in her heart to roast it on the griddle, burn its nose off with red-hot tongs, or to throw it out into the snow and leave it by the roadside to freeze to death, which were recommended practices of getting rid of changelings and having your own child restored to you. I hate to think how many times somebody actually did that, believing their own child was a changeling, but we'll gloss over that. This one's a fairy tale, this one's fictional. So one day Mrs. Sullivan ran across the path of a local wise woman called Ellen, and she asked her, "Why do you look so grief-stricken?" And Mrs. Sullivan replied that she had damn good cause to be, because her child had been whipped out of its cradle without so much as a by your leave or beg your pardon, and an ugly shrivelled fairy was left in the cradle in its place. Ellen then turned to ask her, "If I gave advice, would you listen and would you take it? Or would you just dismiss it as being a foolish old woman's fancy?" Ellen told her that she had to put on the biggest pot she could find, put it on the fire and fill it with water and get it to boiling point. And then she was to get a dozen freshly laid eggs, break them open, but keep the shells, throw what was inside the eggs away, and put the shells in the boiling water. And she would know soon enough whether it was in fact a fairy that was in the cradle. That's my phone, I forgot to put it on silent. Whether it was a fairy that she had, or whether it was her own son, and she was just going a bit doolally. Which she could be, I imagine, if you've got a baby crying all the time, you probably go a little bit, puddled. And if she should find that she has a fairy in the cradle, then she had to take a red-hot poker and cram it down the fairy's ugly throat, and she won't have much trouble after that. If you did that to anybody, you probably wouldn't have much trouble after that either. So the woman hurried home and started to do exactly what Ellen had told her. She put the pot on the fire, put the turf under it, and set it to boiling, as much as she could, as fast as she could. Now, the child in the cradle was lying quiet for a change. It had stopped crying and was busy watching what she was doing with a kind of a twinkle in its eye. He looked with great attention from the boiling pot to Mrs. Sullivan breaking the eggs and putting only the shells in the water instead of the insides as well. At last, in the voice of a very old man, the baby asked her, "What are you doing?" Now the woman's heart went up into her mouth, and she thought that it would choke her as she heard this ancient voice come out of this small baby. But she contrived to slide the poker in the fire and get it red hot because she was going to ram it down its throat. And she tried to answer without giving away that she was shook up by hearing this voice. And she just simply answered that she was brewing. "But what are you brewing?" said the imp, whose speech now proved beyond any reasonable doubt that this was in fact a fairy and not her child, because a baby don't talk like that. Now, the poker that she'd put in the fire was quite a big one, and it was taking a long time to heat up, so she contrived to keep this baby talking until it was hot enough to tear it down its throat. And therefore she repeated the question back at him. And the fairy, not getting an answer to his question, asked the question again, to say, "What are you doing?" And she replied, "I'm brewing eggshells." And at that the imp shrieked, clapped his hands, and jumped up from the cradle, declaring that in 1500 years he had never heard of anybody brewing eggshells. And by this time the poker was hot and ready, and Mrs. Sullivan seized it and ran furiously towards the cradle. But the clumsy bitch got tangled in her own feet and went face first on the floor, and the poker went to the other end of the house. However, she jumped up without hardly any time wasted and grabbed up the cradle, intending to throw the whole lot, baby, cradle, everything, into this pot of boiling water, when she happened to look inside, and in the cradle was her own baby, sweetly asleep on his pillow. His face was smooth, serene, peaceful, and he moved with gentle, regular breathing. So you can decide for yourself, was this actually a changeling story, or was this a manic episode brought on by no sleep because of a baby constantly crying? So if you like this little tale, please drop me a like, comment and subscribe down below, and don't forget to keep reading.